Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second of two sessions this month, organised by Edgware United Synagogue before the end of the calendar year to commemorate 150 years of the United Synagogue. You can find the complete biannual programme on our website, www.edgwareu.com, and recorded past sessions on our Edgware US YouTube channel. This afternoon's topic is 150 years of the Minhag Anglia, and our guest speaker is Rabbi Raymond speaking to us direct from Jerusalem. The United Synagogue was established in 1870, 150 years ago, and Rabbi Apple and I together have a combined age which exceeds that figure, although most of it has obviously been in the second half of that period. We have witnessed enormous changes in practice and attitudes during that time. Let me give you some examples. In 1983, I became one of the honorary officers at Wembley United, and we decided to discard our top hats. At the AGM in 1984, there was one motion from the community to insist that we restore the wearing of top hats, and the motion was carried. I'm a product of the United Synagogue. I was bar mitzvahed in Kingsbury United by a rabbi who wore canonicals and also a dog collar, where pre-bar mitzvah I was given a chumash to hold to make up a minyan on a Friday night, where the Minhag Anglia started on page 94b in the Old Singer's Prayer Book, and where only one tune to L'chod Odi was ever heard. L'chod Odi L'hikras Kalor. The highlight of Bnei Akiva was the Rikudim, the dancing. In those days, the US had no mikveh, no Eruvim, and no one wore a talus over their head in shul or walked with their tzitzis worn externally in the street. Hardly anyone worried about renting cheese. Midweek cheder teas served penguin biscuits, and kosher caterers issued a disclaimer at functions about non-supervised wine being served, and the men only put on yarmulkes for the benching. I've now lived in Edgware for 7 years, and it's a totally different place from the one I remember when I last lived here in the 1970s. Then there were only 3 Orthodox shuls, the United, the Fed and the Adas. Now there are 15, most of them strictly Orthodox. Then there were only just 2 delis. Now there is a plethora of kosher butchers, delis, restaurants, bakers and other Jewish shops. In shul, there was only 1 adult service and a children's service at Edgware United. Now we have 5 adult services and many children's and toddler services. That is the background. This afternoon, our speaker, Rabbi Raymond will be giving us an insight into how and why what is termed the Minhag Anglia has evolved over the years, and we'll have a shot at anticipating what the future might hold for middle-of-the-road Central Orthodox Judaism in this country, particularly in the United Synagogue. He was born and educated in Australia before studying at the then Jews College, where he received a teaching diploma and his rabbinic diploma. He served as the minister at Bayswater and then Hampstead United Synagogues for 12 years, and was a member of the Chief Rabbi's Cabinet, Religious Director of the Association for Jewish Youth, Director of Jewish Chaplaincy at British Universities, Chairman of the Jewish Marriage Council, and President of the Union of Anglo-Jewish Preachers. He then accepted a call to serve as senior minister in the Sydney Great Synagogue, where he held that office for 32 years. During that time, he served as a Dayan and registrar for the Beth Din. He was for many years the rabbi with the highest profile in Australia, and the leading spokesman for Judaism, holding the post of President of the Council of Christians and Jews and the Jewish Historical Society, and was Senior Jewish Chaplain to the Defence Forces. Among honours bestowed on him was his investiture as an officer of the Order of Australia for his services to the community, and he holds both the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal and the Centenary of Federation Medal. He has written many books and numerous articles on Jews, Jewish history and interfaith themes. He is the author of Oz Torah, a weekly email service and website presenting insights into the Torah reading. He now lives in Jerusalem, and I shall hand over to him for what promises to be an interesting, fascinating and important talk on 150 years of the Minhag Anglia. At the end, he has kindly agreed to answer your questions and respond to your comments. At that point, you can wave your virtual hand.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I was going to tell you that I looked up this subject on Google online, and I discovered that I am supposed to be the expert who has researched and written and presented the subject to countless audiences. So I didn't learn anything online, but what I want to do is to tell you firstly why I became involved in this subject, who I am, and why, if it's possible to attempt this, why there is such a thing as Minhag Anglia. We will then proceed to ask the question of whether Minhag Anglia is purely and simply something which has to do with the Siddur and prayers, or whether it could have a broader interpretation, and where Minhag Anglia is likely to be in the years to come. Let me begin by talking about the subjects on which I am the expert, namely myself. Well, actually, my wife, who has been by my side since 1960, which means that this is our 60th wedding anniversary. My wife probably knows me better than I do. And I used to say that my wife has a much better judgment of people than I do, but I have a better judgment of situations. Well, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But as we've been told by Spencer, my career began in Australia. I came to England as a student. I decided long before leaving Australia that I had to do what young Australians had always done, which was to go, in inverted commas, home. To people who lived out in the wilds of the empire, Britain was home. So I came home in order to study. I stayed, as you've been told, for quite a number of years. I spent 5 years as the minister of the old Bayswater Synagogue, Alava Shalom, 7.5 years in Hampstead, and then returned to Australia, where I spent 32 years before retiring. Eventually, having retired, my wife and I came to the conclusion that our attempt, which we thought was a good idea, to spend half the year in Australia and half in Israel, was simply not practical. So we made Aliyah, and now we live in Jerusalem, where most of our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren live. Now, the first question that I want to ask is the question of why should I, or for that matter you, have the slightest interest in the subject known as Minhag Anglia, bearing in mind that Minhag, a custom, is something which tells you what the people do. And what the people do is never going to be something fixed and inflexible. What people do is always going to change. So Minhag Anglia, whenever it came into being, and we'll look at that in a moment, could never be regarded as the last word on the subject. Why then should anyone take any interest in the subject? The answer is that the two words Minhag and Anglia tell you something about what this whole concept was trying to do. Minhag means something which, in accordance to the Hebrew etymology, really means to drive or to conduct oneself. The driver on an Israeli bus is the nehag. In fact, there are two words which you'll hear in any bus in Jerusalem or anywhere else. One is nehag, where you call out for the driver, and the second is rega, rega, hold it a minute, hold it a minute. So even if you don't know any other Hebrew, you know nehag and you know rega. Well, the first thing that we discover about Minhag Anglia is that it is Jewish. The second thing, Anglia, tells us that it's English. So we learn things about Jewishness, about Englishness, by looking at Minhag Anglia. Let's ask the question, where did Minhag Anglia begin? There are those who say that it began somewhere in the 19th century, during the period when Nathan Marcus Adler was the chief rabbi. It's an understandable explanation, but it's not true. There was already a Minhag Anglia in the Middle Ages, and there is a 3-volume work edited by the late Chief Rabbi Israel Brody, which explains what the minhagim of the medieval Anglo-Jewish community were all about. Nathan Marcus Adler did not invent Minhag Anglia in the 19th century. He inherited it, but what he did was to consolidate and to export Minhag Anglia, so that when you look at the history, as I did in my Australian period, you look at the history of the Australian Jewish congregations, and for that matter, you could go also to New Zealand, you could go to Canada, you could go to South Africa, etc., etc. You discover all sorts of things which emanated from Nathan Marcus Adler. Sometimes Minhag Anglia in Britain itself moved on faster than it did in other countries. We've been told a few moments ago about the controversies to do with honorary officers wearing top hats. Let me tell you that long after Anglo Jewry decided that the top hats had to be retired, the great synagogue in Sydney still insisted that its honorary officers wore black coats, black jackets, striped trousers, top hats. And when I used to ask the question, why do you want to do something so old-fashioned, which even Britain has discarded, I was told, but it's good for the marketing. Well, this may be the case, but in the meantime, things have eventually caught up with Britain. Now, why the title Minhag Anglia? Answer, nobody can tell you. There is a theory which is possibly correct, that in 19th century American Jewry, the reform leader, I.M. Wise, produced a prayer book which he thought was appropriate for American use. He called it Minhag America. And so it is just possible that the term Minhag Anglia was a response to Minhag America. Nobody knows. I decided in my look at what Google had to say about Minhag Anglia that I would try to check up when the term was first used in the United Synagogue. And the answer seems to be that it was in the 1920s when somebody or other at a meeting of the United Synagogue Council happened incidentally to speak about how things were done in Britain and used the phrase Minhag Anglia. Where he got it and whether other people understood what he's talking about, we don't know. But it could well be that it's the United Synagogue Council in the 1920s, which for some reason and in some way originated, or at least first recognized, the title Minhag Anglia. The late Chief Rabbi Brody, whom I've mentioned already, sent a response to a question from the Hampstead Synagogue in the 1950s, I think. Hampstead decided that there were Kohanim who wanted to duchen. Duchening, Birkat Kohanim, had never been known in Hampstead. They asked Rabbi Brody. Rabbi Brody sent a reply that Hampstead had to allow any Kohen who so desired to utter the priestly blessing on festivals, on occasions when it was the English minhag to do so, which means that not only the United Synagogue Council, but the Chief Rabbinate recognize the existence of Minhag Anglia without necessarily being able to point to a source. Well, now we ask the question, what did the Minhag Anglia, which Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler worked on, consist of? And here we're fortunate in that there is a book. You probably can't see the title from where you are, but don't worry. This is a book called Torah Minhagim, Studies of the Nusachat Filah and Other Minhagim of the United Synagogue, London, written by Diane I. Lerner, MA, PhD. What Diane Lerner did was to look at the early manuscript prayer books of the London synagogues and to discover that each of the original London synagogues borrowed minhagim from the cities and countries of origin of the members of the congregation. In many cases, the source was Hamburg. This explains why, if you look at the Singer Siddur up to the last edition or two, they said that the Siddur which Singer put together was Minhag Polin, the Polish custom. Now, if you look at your atlas, you'll discover that Poland does not necessarily include Hamburg, but the borders between European countries were so flexible as the result of wars and conflicts that one could never be certain whether Hamburg at a particular time was Pauline or not Pauline. So the original Singer's Siddur, like many of the customs which Diane Lerner put together, represented Minhag Pauline. Only in recent editions has the word Minhag Anglia been added. And so if you look at the latest Singer's Siddur, edited by the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, you'll find that he recognizes that certain things are Minhag Anglia. Now, what were the particular issues in Minhag Anglia, and why does it matter? Well, I made a list for myself, and I'll share it with you. Examples of Minhag Anglia are the fact that many of the mystical meditations said before saying certain prayers or carrying out certain rituals were omitted. Many of the piyutim, the religious hymns, were omitted. The question of who should say Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, was answered in many of these places by the fact that all Avelim, all mourners, should join together in saying Kaddish instead of having one person doing it on behalf of the congregation. There was the issue of how many shofar blasts should be heard on Rosh Hashanah. These days, we tend to say you have to have 100, which in itself is also only a custom, but that's another issue. But Minhag Anglia, in its earlier formulation, had much less than 100 blasts of the shofar. The number which they tended to blow was 42. The question of Kabbalat Shabbat, the Friday evening service. At the end of L'Chadodi, should the congregation face the back of the synagogue or remain in place? At the end of the service on Friday night, should the congregation sing Adon Olam or Yigdal? The question of which psalms should be said. Should we say Psalm 30 in the early morning service? Should we say Psalm 130, Shir HaMa'alot, on the Yamim Noraim before Baruch Hu in the evening and the morning? Should the ark be left open during the High Holy Day services, or should it be opened and closed at intervals for particular prayers? Now, you're possibly going to say, none of these things is really that exciting, and you'd be right. The minhagim are not necessarily required in a particular form by the halakha, but it's a question of what was done in this community or that community. So what Diane Lerner researched before writing his book was what was the general feeling in Anglo Jewry as a result of things that they had brought with them from Hamburg and elsewhere. If you look at the services we conduct today, in many cases, we've moved on from these earlier Minhag Anglia prayers, which tells us that the first stage in Minhag Anglia was liturgical. It had to do with prayers. But when you think of some of the songs that you're used to from being British, you know that there is the song Wider Still and Wider. And this is exactly what happened to Minhag Anglia. It went wider still and wider. It began liturgically, but then it became a custom or a series of customs to do with how you behaved in shul. Now, how you behave in shul is something which is often the despair of honorary officers and ministers, where they think the congregations need to be taught how to sit nicely, how to stand nicely, and how to be quiet. Well, how to behave in shul became one of the extensions, wider still and wider, one of the extensions of the original Minhag Anglia. And then came things. I hope my wife is going to answer the phone. She's running. Okay. The second stage after liturgy then is the question of how to behave in shul. But it included whether synagogues should be different from each other. Somebody once said that the United Synagogue had become like a series of chain stores, so that, well, I don't know if I'm allowed to offer any advertising on this particular program, but you think, for example, is every Sainsbury's the same? Is every Tesco's the same? The answer is not important, but what is important is the suggestion that how to behave in shul was originally exactly identical, no matter what synagogue you went to. Then came the question of the minister. Not just a question of whether the minister wore cap and gown. It's also a question of what the minister regarded as his most important task. Was his most important task to be a pastor or to be a preacher? Was his task to teach people Torah or to guide people in times of difficulty? Another illustration of how to behave in shul is music. There was a time at which every synagogue gave, if not top billing, then very high up eminence to the so-called Blue Book, where all the melodies were exactly the same. In the introduction, which was given just before I began speaking, there was a reference to Lecha Dodi. It was always the same tune. Well, in the shul in which I was brought up, Aleinu was not sung, except at the very end, and the final line of Aleinu was always the same. Ein Keloheinu was always the same. So how to behave in shul included the choice of music, where today there's much more happy clappy music. There's the question of dress, not just the attire of the ministers, but the attire of the members. I will remember how in my days in the Bayswater Synagogue, all those years ago, there were mutterings of disapproval if anyone came into shul with a red tie or brown shoes. My goodness me. These days, it's very rare that people wear ties, and brown shoes, who could care less? Then came the question of architecture. Originally, one thought that the way to have a shul was that you had to have something designed in a particular way, and it had to have stained glass. The question of decorum. Well, were people allowed to talk to their neighbors in shul? Do you know what a relief it was for me when I made Aliyah? All those years I'd been in the ministry, I'd been sitting up the top there, looking very, very impressive. Nobody except the Almighty. Moved to Israel and found that I could talk to the guy next to me. Well, if anyone ever said to me, what were you talking about in shul? I would always say, Parashat HaShavua. I was talking about the Chumash and about the Seder we read that Shabbat. So we've talked about Minhag Anglia beginning with liturgy, moving to how you behave in shul. But the third thing, which I think is probably the most important aspect of Minhag Anglia, is that there was a feeling that Englishness was something really important. You know, you look at Israel Zangwill's Children of the Ghetto, and there's a reference there to a girl who discovered that she had two histories. There was the history of English kings and queens. There was the history of what happened to the Jews. And if you were to ask which was more important to Israel Zangwill, which is more important to a Minhag Anglia Jew, the answer is neither this nor that, but both. Everything English was regarded as important. So Minhag Anglia was a sort of a Jewish patriotism where you felt that nowhere could be any nicer than Britain. I have to tell you that just last week in the Jerusalem Post of the 8th of December, well, actually it wasn't last week, it was the week before last, but they reported in the Jerusalem Post something which the Sotmara Rebbe had said in the United States, where he made the statement, we're not Americans, we're Jews in exile. A Minhag Anglia Jew would never say, I'm not an Englishman, I'm just a Jew in exile. He was an Englishman. Now, this is where we come to the controversial part of the question. What do English Jews now feel? This is a question for you to answer, not for me, because you are living in England and I left many years ago. It might amuse you to know, incidentally, that next Motzei Shabbat, next Saturday night, please God, I am booked to give a Zoom talk to Young Israel of North Netanya in Israel. And if you want to know why it's called Young Israel, well, the wags will tell you that it's neither young nor Israel, that it's really old Britain. But you walk in there and you see this is really England in exile. Well, let's ask the question, what does an Englishman or an Englishwoman feel these days? And instead of leaving myself just the Jerusalem Post as my source, let me quote the Talmud. There is a famous statement in the Talmud Bava Batra where Rabbi Yochanan says that since the destruction of the temple, prophecy has disappeared, but these days, the only ones who purport to prophesy are shotim v'tinokot. The only ones who purport to prophesy are idiots and infants. Well, can I say something, being, I hope, neither an infant nor an idiot, about what I feel is the situation of British Jews today? And I have the feeling that despite Jeremy Corbyn and despite others who feel that Jews are not necessarily as important in English life as they used to, the really significant thing is that there is a corporate identity which English Jews have. Today, this is what Minhag Anglia is. Minhag Anglia in the year 2020 is a Jewishness which is English, and Englishness which is Jewish. Now, does that mean that an English Jew is a combination of two things which can go together and should go together? And the answer, I believe, is yes. You see, there are those who say it's paradoxical. The Sotmara Rebbe thinks it's paradoxical. You don't feel, if you're in the United States, that you're an American, according to him. You feel that you're a Jew in exile. According to Minhag Anglia, you feel that you are Jewish and English, English and Jewish at one at the same time. What is going to be the case in years to come? I go back to where I began. I said that customs are never permanent, fixed, and inflexible. Customs develop, customs mutate, customs move. Is there going to be a difference between the English Jew, the Minhag Anglia Jew of 2020, and the Minhag Anglia Jew, if there is such a thing, in 30 or 40 years' time? Now, I'm well aware of what the Talmud says, that if you think you can prophesy, then you're either an idiot or you're a baby. So I want to be careful. My feeling here is that the thing which English Jews try to do is to find the essential features of English life and to marry them together with the essential features of Jewish life. Can it be done? Well, the answer is that it always has been done. Nathan Marcus Adler, going right back to when he began in Britain in the 1840s, Nathan Marcus Adler felt that it was possible to find a form of Jewishness which was just right for Britain. And I'm going to quote myself again, because at the beginning of my remarks, I asked your permission if I could talk about myself. I'm going to talk about myself as an Ole, a Jew who has come to live in Israel. In our shul, when it comes to the Shabbat before Pesach and the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, somebody gives a drasha, but the drasha is in Hebrew. We have so many dovrei Anglit, so many English speakers in our shul, that we also have an English drasha, and that tends to be given by me. The first time I gave this drasha, one of the members, who is an elderly rabbi, even older than me, listen to what I have to say. And he said to me, what you said was just right for Jerusalem. Well, I've never had such a compliment. So I'm going to ask you the question, what is the future of Minhag Anglia? The future is when somebody can say, the Minhag Anglia form of Judaism is just right for London, just right for the provinces, just right for England. Well, I'm going to leave it at that and tell you, I wish I had a better answer as to the future of Minhag Anglia. But if I have succeeded in telling you something about how Minhag Anglia began, how it mutated, and where it developed, then I feel that I've done something worthwhile. And speaking from Jerusalem, let me just wish everybody a future of good health and divine blessing, and may all the things that we hope for from Jerusalem come true for you. Please God, this week Israel will begin using the vaccine, and I hope that when the time comes that everyone in Britain can have the vaccine, this will also be something which will be a blessing from the Almighty. Thank you very much for listening, and be well.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Apple. That was fascinating. We'll now open up a discussion. If you have any questions, or you want to give anecdotes or stories, please do so. Please wave your virtual hand and David Lando will unmute you. If you don't know how to do it, David will tell you what to do. David?
Yes, if you open up the participant section, you'll find the tab at the bottom of your screen. If you have a PC, it was possibly on your right if you're looking on a laptop. But if you go to that and you see the icon saying more, and you right click, you should be able to see raise hand. And if you click on that, then I will be able to see you. That's the only means for me to be able to see you, as I only have speaker view. So if you please follow that. And we have a question from Alex Klein. And Spencer, if you'd like to speak to me.
Right, Alex, I'm sure you want to talk about the Blue Book, among other things.
I was very fascinated with this wonderful talk, which was completely different from what I expected. And that is a compliment, because I think Rabbi Apple's take on Minhag Anglia is correct. The difficulty I have is being brought up in London when the United Synagogue was something completely different to what it is today. And I don't mean it was old-fashioned or it became old-fashioned, but the problem today, very intelligent Rabbonim who have got degrees, which is a typically different breed to what we had when I was growing up, because there's no dog collars, there's no Homburgs, there's no canonicals worn in most of the shuls today. But it is, if you lose Nusach or Minhagim, and we end up with one tune, one type of service, happy clappy Karbach, one tune, what are we going to teach our children? And is that going to be the future that we actually deserve or want? Because it seems that no one over the age of 50 or 60 is asked what they want. It's the youngsters are asked what they want, and we seem to be sort of thrown out with the as being either old-fashioned, and when we go to shul, everything is completely strange to us. So what is the answer to what we need today, what we want today? Can we not have a bit of both, but not lose out the nusach, which is so important?
Mm-hmm.
Right, maybe Rabbi, would you like to respond to that?
Right. When I worked for the United Synagogue many decades ago, it certainly was very different from what it is today. It was very stuffy, very formal, and very frightening. Today, I think the United Synagogue has gone through an entire revolution. It has become, well, maybe the word is more user-friendly. Now, this is all for the good. The ministers are also much more rabbinical than they used to be. Once upon a time, the important thing about a minister was that you would see him with his dog collar visiting the sick in a particular hospital, and that was what made him a good minister. Today, the rabbi has to be somebody who has something to say, something to impart, something to share with his congregation. Now, as to whether the emphasis today is too much on the young, or for that matter, too much on the old, you yourself have suggested the answer, that congregations need to work out for themselves exactly what their focus is going to be. And if it means that there have to be within a congregation facilities for all age groups, and for that matter, all interest groups, and am I allowed to say women as well as men, then if we can get congregations to work out this structure on their own, I think you'll find that the future will be assured. Right. Next question.
We have a question here from Rosemary and Jonathan Lewis. You listed some examples of Minhag Anglia in our tefillah. Do you think that as Minhag, these have become halakha for British Jewry?
Well, if you have a look at the Singer Siddur today, as against the original Singer Siddur in the 1890s, you'll see that the basic structure is still as it was. Now, the Minhag Anglia developments aren't all necessarily a carbon copy of what used to be done in United Synagogue congregations. But if there have been changes, I think the changes on the whole have been organic. You know the story of Topsy? Well, people said, Topsy, where did you come from? She said, I didn't come from anywhere, I just growed. Well, these are things that just growed. I think I can say here that there was a time at which I asked my late dear friend Shmuel, or Israel Feinstein, if he knew where the term Minhag Anglia came from. And although he used different phraseology, he basically said it just growed. Well, the things which are done in United Synagogues grow, but the important thing is that it should never be as it used to be, that everything was dictated from head office. Now there has to be this user-friendly situation in which a congregation decides, with the guidance of its rabbi, congregation decides what it wants. So it's not a question of din. A lot of these things aren't din, they are custom. You see, I raised earlier the question of what do you sing on Friday night? You sing Adon Olam or you sing Yigdal? Well, the answer is it's not that important, because the theme of both of them is exactly the same. They're both statements of Jewish theology. It's a matter of minhag. And if your congregation decides that it's going to sing one thing and not another thing, well, so what? When I noticed here in Jerusalem that most congregations end the Friday night service with a Don Olam. I'm quite happy with it. There are other places where they end with Yigdal. I'm quite happy with that as well. It's a matter of what grows. Next question.
We have a question from David Newman. I've got a few here, Spencer, if I could bring them in.
And after that, the Hartmans will have a question.
Yes, I know, but I've got David Newman first. So.
Right.
Hi, Rabbi Apple. We never get to see each other here in Israel. So from Israel via Edgware to Israel, I'll ask you a question. We've corresponded on this in the past, but to what extent are canonicals part of the tradition of Minhag Anglia? I know there are famous stories about it, but I will tell you obviously remember my father, Rabbi Isaac Newman.
Yes.
He was once reprimanded very seriously when we were at Poets Road, when we lived on top of the shul, and davening started at 9:15, but no one came to 9:30. So he came down the stairs at about 12 minutes past 9 to see the resplendent chairman of the shul, I won't mention his name, in his top hat and waistcoat saying, Rabbi Newman, I'm going to put in a complaint to the United Synagogue that you were not here on time 10 minutes before services started in your full canonicals. And I wonder to what extent canonicals were part of this minhag. I should just say that when we eventually went to Barnet, one of the conditions my father made with the new shul was that apart from a rabbi's hat, he would never have to wear canonicals again.
It was originally in the bylaws of the United Synagogue.
Well, that's what they say, but if you ask Stuart Taylor, he will tell you he's looked everywhere and he can't find it in the bylaws.
I thought I found it 10 minutes before the service started, but anyway, Rabbi Apple.
But the whole issue of canonicals is Minhag Anglia.
Well, it is something which was emphasized by Nathan Marcus Adler very much because he came from the continent, and the idea of the canonicals was very much a poor man's version of the German doctoral robe. It certainly provided a certain amount of dignity. Without canonicals, you sometimes find that what you see is rather inappropriate. Let me talk not just about canonicals, but about what the honorary officers wear. On one of my visits from Jerusalem to Sydney, I spent a Shabbat at my old shul, the Great Synagogue, and saw that the vice president was wearing a sports jacket and an open-neck shirt. And I made some rather critical comments. And he said, look, we're not all as old and stuffy as you are. Well, there is an argument in favor of canonicals. But generally speaking, my feeling is that if the rabbi wears a decent, tidy suit and tie, that's perfectly adequate. I don't see any particular religious need for the canonicals. Yes, I know that the Kohanim and the Bet Mikdash, and particularly the Kohen Gadol, had their begadim, but for today's life, I don't see that they contribute anything particular to the religious quality of the service or the synagogue.
Our Chazan still wears a Chazan's hat on a Shabbos. Not the full canonicals, but he wears the Chazan's hat. David, next question. David, can you unmute the Hartmans?
Hi. This is actually on behalf of my husband, who is currently in shul davening.
Good.
And it's actually addressed to Spencer, excuse me, Rabbi Apple, who we met when we came to Australia some years ago. We came to visit your shul and we actually met you, but you probably don't remember us, but we don't mind that because there was lots of people who came to visit you. Spencer, you mentioned that when you were 12 years old, you used to go to shul and put a chumash under your arm to make up the minyan. And this is one of my husband's favourite stories that he tells his grandchildren, that when he was a boy in the Adas here in Edgware, he used to be invited to come to shul and put a chumash under his arm to make up a minyan. So you have something very much in common. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
Nice to know that.
There is, let me say that halachically, there's a whole problem as to how valid this particular minhag of the chumash under your arm really is. But that's another question that you've got to sort out with your own rabbi.
We have another question from David Jacobs, if you're there. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rabbi Apple. I was wondering, what was the title of the book by Israel Brody that you referred to, about the development of minhagim from the Middle Ages in Anglo Jewry?
Well, it was a 3-volume work. It was the Eitz Chaim of, and I'll think of the name of the author in a minute. But the title was definitely Eitz Chaim, which was the medieval Anglo-Jewish liturgical corpus. What Rabbi Brody did was to take this material and to go through and check through the Hebrew and write annotations. It's a very important historical work.
Right.
And we have another question from Alex Shannon, if you could unmute yourself.
Shalom there. I'm from Israel. After 50 years in Israel already. I've followed the Sidurim over the years, and I noticed that they are deteriorating, in my opinion. Some people may say, well, they're being repaired, they're organizing it better and that sort of thing. But I feel that the whole idea of Minhag Anglia has been going down the drain altogether. When I used singers, the original singers, I still have one. And then there was Rabbi Brody's and Rabbi Jacobowicz's, and now Rabbi Zach's. And each one, in my opinion, became less and less special to Minhag Anglia. I still put on my talit without putting it over my head, because this is Minhag Anglia. It's written in Keter Shem Tovim, if you know the book. And all sorts of other things too, various things. The way that we do the talit is a simple thing, but it comes to other things too. I don't say Mizmor Shir Chanukah Habayit every morning before Baruch She'amar. I say that on Hanukkah, of course, and all sorts of things like that. And this is all disappearing very fast. In my opinion, the latest Siddur, Rabbi Zach's, is not Minhag Anglia at all. I get the feeling that the whole idea of Minhag Anglia is something special, and most of the things I try, I attempt to. I'm very fussy about this sort of thing.
Well, you know, we all have our own particular feelings. You know, when I daven at home, which I prefer to do weekdays because I can take my time and emphasize what I want to emphasize. Quite often, I'm saying things by heart because I'm used to them, and they don't always accord with what you find in any particular siddur. But I'm comfortable with what I do. So my advice would be, do whatever you feel comfortable with within the bounds of the halakha, and don't worry too much. I'm going to give you one Israeli illustration. Friday night, before the Amidah of Shabbat, I'm used to singing Shamru V'nei Israel et Shabbat, etc., etc. Minhag Yerushalayim is not to say that at all. So in the shul, they do what they do, and I still say it quietly to myself. and when I'm davening by myself, I sing it. Well, I'm comfortable with things the way I do them, and I don't necessarily need to feel at all guilty if my minhag is what suits me and doesn't always suit other people. Right, anybody else?
We have David Oliver I have on here, so I'm just unmuting him if you're there, David.
Unmute.
Rabbi, this is more of a personal chat. I always remember you when you were probably early 20s and I was about 10 at Hampstead Synagogue. And I hope you remember my dad, Abraham Oliver.
Sure.
You remember him?
Yes, definitely.
And he used to drive you mad with questions.
And I passed his house a few years ago, and I remember that was where Abe Oliver used to live.
Yeah.
Alf Oliver.
Yeah, he was his real question, a real character. But I'm not sure. I mean, we were a very unique shul, Hampstead, and we had quite a unique. He wasn't rabbi, actually, was he? Reverend Levy, who was a real tough guy. But I don't know whether we had any minhag in our shul. We were I think we were the only shul to have a mixed choir, and we had things that Reverend Levy brought in that I've just never seen in any other shuls.
Okay, I'll say something about the mixed choir in a moment, but first let me remind myself, and possibly you, that there was an old guy called Herbert Michaelis. You probably wouldn't remember him. Herbert Michaelis's seat was in the middle block, and he was the keeper of the congregational minhag. Often on a Saturday night, at the end of the service, he would walk home with me and train me in the minhagim of Hampstead. And he said that Hampstead was one of the few places that still maintained the United Synagogue minhag of 1870. This may be, I don't know, but Hampstead certainly had a minhag, and unfortunately, Dr. Levy did not always approve of certain things which I didn't approve of the sermons. And when I went back to my seat after giving a sermon, I could see that he was turning to his neighbor and saying something under his breath, but he had a very fine voice. I didn't, and he was not impressed with the way in which I conducted certain parts of the Shacharit service. Concerning the mixed choir, there were quite a number of United Synagogues which had mixed choirs. I think probably about 14 or 15 United Synagogues. In many cases, they had the mixed choirs because they couldn't find enough boys to provide the high notes. Hampstead was one of these places that stuck to its mixed choir for political reasons. No one is going to tell us what to do. Well, in the end, I got into trouble on my last Yom Kippur in Hampstead. I spoke at Ne'ilah, and I was young and cheeky, and I made the comment that I hoped that the congregation would be open to certain changes in the future, including unmixing the choir. And it was the only time in my whole career that I got booed by the congregation. But anyhow, the disappearance of the mixed choirs was part of the development of the United Synagogue in recent decades, where members of the congregations expressed themselves as in favor of more tradition and more halacha. Well, there were some people in Hampstead who didn't like it. I know there was one particular member in my time who said that when the female soloist sang her line in the De Sola Adon Olam, it sent shivers through him. And I said, and that's Dovka, that's precisely why mixed choirs are a problem, because if the female soloist sends shivers through you, then you've got a halachic problem. But anyhow, Hampstead these days has no mixed choir, and I'm not even certain that they have a regular choir, but that's another question.
Rabbi, would you like to tell the story, which I think you've told in the past, about one of your predecessor rabbis at Hampstead who invited the chief rabbi to a wedding?
Well, there's a famous story. Let me tell you what happened to me. We had a wedding on one particular occasion in Hampstead where there was a Dayan from Manchester who was due to be there because it was his niece or nephew who was getting married. And so he said to me before the wedding, do you think you could make sure that only the men sing during the chuppah? I said, look, we can probably do that. Might I suggest, let them sing their Baruch Haba and Hariu before you come in, and then you make an entrance, so they will have sung their mixed choir things, and we would have a problem. But I forgot to tell the choir master that in the middle of the Sheva Barachot, when the choir sings Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, and Amen, that only the men should sing. So when at that particular point, the Chazan sang the bracha, and the choir, including the women, sang Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, the Dayan turned to me and he said in a stage whisper, what are they, castrated males?
Yeah.
And okay, anyhow,
right.
We have a question.
We survived.
You can take one or two more questions before.
Okay, we've got Shlomo Kryman.
Thank you very much indeed. Rabbi, I have to tell you, you came with tremendous credentials. You've been spoken of so highly by a late lamented colleague of ours, the Reverend Alan Greenback. Alan Greenback spoke of you very often and very highly, and I want to tell you this afternoon has been a revelation and a pleasure. He also said, and I just want to confirm this with you, that Hampstead is definitely the source of Minhag Anglia. But I want to move the subject sideways to ask you a question, not about the Singer's Siddur, but rather the Routledge Machzorim. Now, I long ago dispensed with anything like that, but there are those who still use them, Lahavdil. And I just wanted to ask you if you consider, as Alan Oliver Shalom did, that they were in fact based on the Minhagim of Hampstead Shul and were representative of that Minhag.
Firstly, thank you very much for mentioning Alan Greenback. He was a very good friend of ours, and we miss him very much. We always used to see him when we happened to be in London, and in the days in which he was working as the director of the Victoria clubs in North London, he would sometimes bring me in to take part in the programs of the club, and I found that seeing Alan looking very serious and very official and formal as the judge and in a mock trial rather frightened me, as it frightened the kids. Now, as to whether Hampstead is the source of Minhag Anglia, the answer is no. Minhag Anglia was building up before Hampstead came into being in 1892. What Hampstead did was to be revolutionary in that it wanted certain things which were not permissible halachically. For instance, it wanted a minister, the Reverend Morris Joseph, who did not believe in the restoration of sacrifices. And the then chief rabbi did what he had to do halachically and said that this man cannot be the minister there. Minhag Anglia existed already in Hampstead, but Hampstead probably held on to it much longer. The Routledge Machzor was not really the product of Hampstead. The Routledge Machzor came into being in a rather convoluted way as the result of the efforts of Nathan Marcus Adler, who died when the material was being worked on, and the editing was then taken over by somebody else. So Hampstead stood for these things much longer than most other places. But the last time we were in Hampstead, a few years ago, we saw that certain things had changed. So not even Hampstead is following the Minhag Anglia of the 19th century.
Right.
Spencer, do you want to deal with anything that's in the chat? There are no questions on through the participants at the moment.
Well, I think we'll then wind up. If you want to see this afternoon's session again, you'll find it on our dedicated Edgeway US YouTube channel. And please remember to hit the like button and share it with others. Many of our past sessions can be found on the Edgeway US YouTube channel, and the half-yearly adult education program can be found on the events page of our website, which I mentioned, www.edgewayu.com, where you'll find all the sessions until Pesach. We look forward to welcoming you in 2021. Now, 2020 was the year when we realized that our education program could go global, and I am most grateful that Rabbi Raymond has spoken to us live from Jerusalem. In the next biannual program from Pesach onwards, we have already arranged a session from America. I'm sure that people will now be much better informed about the direction of Central Orthodoxy, and in particular how it relates to the United Synagogue. Rabbi Apple has given us a most eloquent and informative bird's eye view of where we in the United Synagogue have come from and the direction in which we are heading. In 1970, he contributed a learned chapter to the book, A Century of Anglo-Jewish Life, 1870 to 1970. Today, 50 years on, he has updated his contribution. Perhaps we can look forward to a further update in 2070. We wish you, Rabbi Apple, and everyone watching a healthy and safe new year, and look forward to a return to normal life soon, when once again our shuls will be the beating heart of the community. Thank you very much.